BioCentury This Week is brought to you by Icon Biotech. As a world-leading healthcare intelligence and clinical research organization dedicated to the needs of small and mid-sized biopharma companies, Icon Biotech helps biotech organizations meet their critical milestones and deliver data and evidence-based results to investors, large pharma partners, and regulatory authorities. Icon Biotech advances clinical research by offering integrated outsourced services and solutions delivered by dedicated biotech teams and management that understand the different pressures faced by biotechs in their drive to solve today's challenges without losing sight of their mission to deliver life-changing innovations tomorrow.
ASCO has wrapped up in Chicago, and the translational trends at this year's meeting converged on new and selective ways to target cell surface receptors on solid tumors. The goals of these programs are to make the industry's most transformational modalities more efficacious against solid tumors and find new ways to treat the solid tumor types that haven't been well served by more traditional mechanisms. So says my BioCentury colleague Lauren Martz in her annual look at first-in-human studies at this year's meeting of the American Society of Clinical Oncology. We'll discuss that on the BioCentury This Week podcast, plus signs of strain and resilience in biotech's crossover investor crowd, and FDA's plans for revamping rare disease regulation. I'm Jeff Cranmer, and joining me today on the BioCentury podcast are my colleagues
Stephen Hansen, Director of Biopharma Intelligence.
Lauren Martz, Executive Director of Biopharma Intelligence.
And Steve Usden, Washington Editor.
All righty, let's dig right into ASCO and Lauren's annual look at first-in-human data. But first up, Lauren, I think we need to be very clear on how we define first-in-human.
Sure, Jeff. So for the purposes of this analysis, we define first-in-human as the first time that a therapy is being tested in people. This includes the first time data is being presented or descriptions of trials in progress in the ASCO abstracts. We excluded data from expansion cohorts where significant data has already been presented.
All right. Well, Lauren, where do you want to start? I had a lot of fun editing this one high up in the California mountains with very weak Wi-Fi, but, I learned a lot. It seems like there's quite a bit going on in this space. What got you most excited?
Or there is a lot. There's always a lot. So we found 124 first-in-human studies that met our criteria. I think these are always fun to look at because it's kind of just gives you a sense of the direction of translational innovation, what the next crop of clinical stage products is going to look like. And so these are always kind of the most innovative programs in the space because these are the oncology programs that companies are choosing to profile at ASCO. But as you mentioned earlier, I think one of the most striking things from this data set was the abundance of cell surface antigens on solid tumors as targets. So of the 18 targets that were addressed by more than one first-in-human program at ASCO, 16 of them were cell surface antigens, and most of those were expressed on solid tumors. I think the exceptions are CD19 and BCMA, but there were only a couple against those well-validated heme cancer targets. So this may not be surprising, but I think that does reflect a shift in innovation that we're seeing from, small molecules designed to block intracellular signaling pathways that can drive cancer growth to extracellular targets that can apply the antibody-based therapies or the cell-based therapies to different cancer types. And in this case, there's a big movement towards solid tumors. That's also reflected in the modalities data that we saw. As always, small molecules were the most popular modality at 28, but there were almost as many ADCs this year at 25. And then if you count up the number of antibody-based modalities overall, the ADCs, the bispecifics, the mAbs, there were only a couple, and the immunocytokines, which I think are really interesting. But if you add all these together, there are twice as many antibody-based modality therapies as there were small molecules in this group.
So another thing I think that's interesting you highlighted is the number of these first-in-human trials that included a component from China, right? And a lot of people, I think, coming out of ASCO this year have said, really it's becoming more and more clear that it's kind of a China moment people are talking about. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So we did look at the number of abstracts that had at least one investigator from an institution in China or a company in China, and it was over a third. So there were 35% within that set of 124, which is consistent with what we've been seeing in a lot of our data analyses, and especially in the antibody-based therapies. There's always a lot of activity coming out of China.
Lauren, I was wondering, just with regard to the targets that you were seeing in these first-in-human studies, did you see any trends emerge in terms of being able to bucket these targets into different settings, or IO versus precision medicine or anything like that?
Yeah, so almost all of the targets that showed up more than once, as I said, were sort of solid tumor cell surface antigens. Within that set of targets that came up more than once, there were only a couple that fell into the IO space. PD-1 was one of the most popular. That appeared in 5 first-in-human abstracts. And what I thought was really interesting in those is that none of these were anti-PD-1 mAbs. So, in past years, obviously that was everywhere. Every single one of these was what we're calling, there are different names for it, but we're calling it here immunocytokines. So these are anti-PD-1 mAbs. They're fused to a cytokine. And this is kind of similar to the concept of combining an anti-PD-1 with a VEGF, for example, where, if you deliver cytokines systemically, they can have big inflammatory reactions in people. It can lead to big inflammatory reactions in people. If you attach them to an anti-PD-1 antibody, that can help them home to the inflamed tumor site where there are T cells present that are expressing PD-1. And you can sort of better harness where you're getting that increased inflammatory reaction from the cytokines. It can also, affect the way that the T cells or the other immune cells are being activated within that tumor microenvironment. So I think this was a really interesting trend within the IO space. Again, there was not a lot of IO. TIGIT was also on the list, and that was not just standard anti-TIGIT mAbs, which we've seen have a ton of trouble lately. That was more like bispecifics. But yeah, within the immunocytokine space, that was sort of one of the hot topics, even though there were just 5 in the first-in-humans. It was a hot topic at the meeting because we saw some really encouraging data from Innovent for IDI 363, which is an anti-PD-1 fused to an IL-2 that has sort of affinity for the IL-2 receptor alpha. And they tested in 3 different indications. I think the non-small cell lung cancer data was really interesting, with almost a 37% ORR in the squamous subset of patients. These are patients who have already been exposed to an anti-PD-1 therapy. So that's a really interesting modality that I think people will continue to watch.
And another modality you highlight in your story is in vivo CAR cell therapies, right?
Yes. So there was just one in vivo CAR T that was from Umoja, which is one of the first programs to be taken into the clinic. And this is the first year we've seen the in vivo cell therapies included in the clinical trial abstracts. And these are just trials in progress. We haven't seen full data from a phase 1 trial of an in vivo CAR T yet. We've seen individual patient data from a couple of IITs in China. But this just reflects the movement of that field into clinical development over the past few months, which is really interesting because instead of delivering a CAR T cell therapy, you're delivering just the viral vector or the non-viral vector to a patient in the same way that you would a gene therapy to target the patient's T cells within their bodies, create the CAR T cell within a patient, and it eliminates a lot of the manufacturing complexity and the costs and many of the struggles that CAR T cell therapies have had, patient access wise and cost wise potentially. And then within the CAR T cell space, I think it was also really interesting that for the autologous CAR Ts, there was only one non-Hodgkin's lymphoma program, and that was a rapid CAR T against multiple targets, so it was highly innovative, but almost everything was solid tumor CAR Ts, which have been a big challenge, and I think it's very encouraging that so many companies are working in that area.
Let's talk indications quickly. I know B-cell lymphoma you tabbed as last year's top indication for first-in-human studies. What'd you find this year?
So it was definitely not the top this year. I think that reflects some of the movement of the CAR Ts away from heme cancers, that, CAR Ts were in a lot of cases driving some of the B cell lymphoma activity, and they've been very effective in those indications. So this year, lung and prostate cancer were the biggest translational indications. I think a lot of the prostate cancer activity was really driven by the advances in radioligand therapy, because that's sort of the proof of concept indication for that modality. A lot of the lung cancer research is around EGFR targeted therapies. This continues to be just the hottest target space. A lot of fourth generation EGFR inhibitors and ADCs and bispecifics, different ways to try to overcome resistance of EGFR targeted therapies. And then just one other thing that I thought was interesting in the indications was the fact that the sort of next level of popular indications were those that have been pretty challenging to treat: gastric cancers, ovarian cancers. And gastric has been a big trend at ASCO this year. A couple of the plenary sessions were focused on immunotherapies for gastric cancer and had some really great data. So it just reflects activity and progress in indications that have been harder to treat, which is great.
All right, Lauren. Well, thank you, as always, for digging into that. It's one of the highlights of our ASCO coverage, and you can click on the link in the show notes. Hey, and while you're there, if you like what you're hearing, definitely leave us a review, subscribe, send us a question. We'd love to answer it on an upcoming podcast. We're going to take a quick break, and then we will be back to take a look at crossover investors.
BioCentury This Week is supported by the BioCentury Conference Series. For 3 decades, BioCentury has helped biopharma executives and investors make business-critical decisions and build larger networks with peers across the biopharma innovation ecosystem. Our goals are simple: gather the right people in the room to partner, network, and debate critical issues facing the biotech industry. BioCentury's upcoming events span the globe and feature topics from translation to company building to deal making and investment. We hope to see you on the road at an upcoming BioCentury event. Visit biocenturyontheroad.com for more information and to register.
All righty, we are back. Stephen, you have spent a fair amount of time digging through 13F filings to get a picture of venture activity, the health of crossover investors. But maybe we should just sort of start from the top. What is a 13F filing, and what can you learn, and sort of what are the limitations of doing the analysis that you did?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Jeff. I think I'm going to take it back even a step further than that, and just sort of what the genesis of this story was. So in the springtime, there was quite a bit of rumors circulating and sort of gossip about which investors, which specialists are doing well, which ones are in trouble. And there were lots of names being kind of thrown around with really nothing substantial behind it, other than I heard from someone that knows someone who works there and says that it's all panic and, there were fire drills being done. So, and these sort of conversations continue to happen ahead of our bioequity conference in Bruges a couple weeks ago, and then they picked up and they were happening at the conference as well. And so, in light of that, we sort of tried to think about, well, what's a way that we could try and get at this that's a bit more quantitative as opposed to just relying on hearsay and what people are telling us. And so, the best way to try and do this, we thought, was to, as you mentioned, sort of try and look at the 13F filings, which are SEC filings. So any investor that owns public equities that are listed in the US and they're a qualified investor has to submit these filings to the SEC once a quarter. So this is very basic information. It just lists the number of shares you own in any publicly listed US company, the number of shares you owned, what their cumulative value was at the end of the quarter, and then the type of ownership stake it is. And it's a full list. So basically it's their publicly listed portfolio at each time point. And, we don't have the capacity right now, at least, to look at every specialist biotech investor that we know of to look at what their public investment portfolio looks like. So to make it a bit more manageable, we looked at the most active investors that did Series C, Series D, or public equity, disclosed public equity financing, basically over the past 5 years. The whole point was to try and capture who are those sort of specialist crossover investors, and these are some of the primary places where they invest. So we took the top 15 list from that, and then we pulled the filings. We pulled the 13F filings for the end of 2024 through to the end of the first quarter. And we analyzed the changes that happened between these two dates. Now, the caveats that we need to say here are that the things that we don't know, what the 13F filings don't tell you is they don't tell you about any short positions that investors hold. They don't tell you about any other hedging strategies that these firms might be doing to limit their exposure to the markets. They also don't offer any visibility into international holdings. So if they own companies that are not listed in the US, we don't have any visibility on that from the 13Fs. So there's quite a bit that you don't still know. And obviously, most of these firms also invest heavily on the private side as well. And so we don't know what those stakes are. We don't know how the values have changed on those. So it is, I think we need to admit up front that this is a fairly limited window into it. But I do think, having done the exercise, I do think that it does show some trends that at least, can point you in certain directions on the relative health of one firm versus maybe what you're seeing from another. What we did is we took the data that we had from the 13Fs. We also analyzed data from our BCIQ database on disclosed venture investment activity and sort of combined all these metrics together and just made a grid of the data where you could then highlight who's had the largest reduction in the number of shares they've owned over the past 3 months, who had the largest number of sold out positions versus not opening new positions, who increased had the least number of increases in stakes in owned companies versus who were heavily decreasing their ownership stakes. When you add this all together and you look at venture activity, let's say over the last 5 years, a VC had on average done like 20 deals, both public or private deals a year. If in the first quarter they did, 4 or 5, then you'd say, okay, well, they're kind of on pace to be as active as they have been historically. But if they haven't done any in the first quarter, then that's maybe a bit of a red flag, right? So you can kind of look at all these separate data points and kind of pick out what might be a red flag, what's not a red flag. And then when you look across the grid, if you see 3, 4, 5, 6 red flags for any single firm, then it makes you start to wonder whether this is, again, we are by no means stating, from a quantitative standpoint that they are in financial trouble. But as I said, these are red flags that make you wonder whether that's signs of a firm that's maybe not doing as well as others might hope.
All right, Steven, well, give us some of the juice here. What'd you find?
So what we found actually, based on, put it this way, based on some of the gossip and the rumors that I'd been hearing in the run-up to doing this, it actually looks a lot better than I thought it was going to be. I thought it was going to be a lot more red than what I actually found. So we'll start on the positive side first, maybe just to start that way. Of these 15 firms, Deep Track was sort of the one that had sort of the best look. So Deep Track Capital has been quite active over the last couple of years, but they also looked like, they were one of the few where they had a positive change in the value of their portfolio. They were increasing the number of deals they were doing. So that was one of the positive ones. The one, though, that comes out with the biggest number of red boxes in my little grid is Boxer Capital. So they saw a pretty significant fall off in the change in value for their public portfolio. So it fell nearly 72% in just one quarter. They sold out of 34 positions and only started 2 new positions in that public portfolio. And then on the venture side, in terms of activity, so over the past 5 years, they've typically done about 15 deals a year. And they haven't done any so far this year. And actually, the last time we had them doing a deal was back in September. So they're running on, nearly a 9-month drought in terms of the last time we saw them invested. So again, one possible explanation is that they are sort of drastically looking to minimize their public market exposure, given the volatility that we saw in the markets in the first quarter. That is a possibility. But the other possibility is that maybe they are facing redemptions, and so they're having to sell positions to get cash so that they can pay their LPs. So obviously we don't know either way, but kind of given what we've all seen together, that's, makes me at least speculate. My speculation would be that they're probably in a pretty tough spot right now.
And we should say that you reached out to all of the firms that you covered.
That's right.
And I know that that firm in particular just didn't respond.
That's right.
A
I reached
bunch
out
said
to,
no comment, but one talked to you, and it's not surprising, perhaps, which firm that was. You got to speak with Peter Kolchinsky over at RA Capital. What did Peter have to say?
well, I maybe modify that a bit. I got an emailed response from Peter at RA Capital in
Okay,
response to my
there you are.
questions. Um, but no, it was, he's very nice. He basically just sort of said, like, look, when you're trying to, it's really difficult to look and to figure out what a firm's financial health is. But he's like, the simplest thing to do is look at investments that they're making or not making. If they're adding venture positions and they're doing private financings, that's probably a sign that they're doing okay. And I also want to qualify that this came in sort of right before we published, so it didn't really impinge or impact on how we were doing this analysis. The analysis had already been done, but it did, I guess, speak to the fact that if you're seeing a firm that's still being active on the private side, that's a good, at least a good marker for them being okay. And so that's why, when we were looking at these deals that they were participating in, when you have some of these firms that normally had been very, very active, and then you're only seeing one deal or two deals, being participated in this year, it does throw up a red flag in terms of how well they're doing.
And so a few of the companies taking the most new stakes, you did mention Deep Track at 16, I believe. Who else were up there?
I mean, yep. So you mean taking new positions
Yeah.
in their public portfolio? So yeah, I mean, the Deep Track was the most active in that respect, but then I mean, a lot of it is looking sort of relative to how many they sold out of as well. So like RA Capital had 11 new positions versus 15 sold out. Perceptive had 15 new positions, but then they also sold out at 27 and reduced their stake in 29, right? So it's obviously there's a lot of active portfolio management in these firms, right? So selling out and buying into new positions, that's nothing new. This happens every quarter. It's just when you have a disparity, right? When you're heavy on one and very low on the other, that's where you can start to wonder a bit. Like I think a lot of people will, if you've followed the crossover space, you'll probably be familiar with Rock Springs Capital, which we would often see in good times, being a lot of crossover deals. Well, they were, for instance, they sold out of 17 positions, but only opened 6 new ones. And then they reduced their stake in 47 of their positions and only increased it in 25. So it's when you kind of start to see that disparity, that's where you start to wonder.
All right. Well, Steven's very interesting analysis available at biocenturypodcast.com. Let's turn to FDA. Steve, I know you have a particular interest in regulation of rare disease therapies. Your story took a look at what may be some shifts in how FDA is going to handle rare, ultra-rare therapies. What did you find?
So I went to a scientific symposium that was sponsored by NORD. It was, I'd say the overall impression that I received from FDA leadership there is they want to communicate that the facilitating the development of drugs for rare diseases is a high priority for them. The most interesting talk maybe was from Vinay Prasad, the newly minted director of the Center for Biologics, CBER. He kind of went out of his way to say, he said a lot of things over the years before he was at FDA as an academic scientist. People have interpreted them in various ways. And he kind of went out of his way to say, look, he believes that approving therapies for rare diseases is a high priority. He wanted to make it clear that there isn't going to be abrupt changes from what's happened in the past, except to the extent that they come up with changes that he believes will speed the development of therapies for orphan and rare diseases. There was a very interesting panel with FDA leaders talking about where they see things going. Nicole Verdun, director of CBER's Office of Therapeutic Products, it's a super office. She said, well, look, she acknowledged that in the past, CBER policies have contributed to obstacles to the development of therapies for rare disorders. And she said, look, we're changing those policies. We've changed some of those policies. And she said, some of the therapies that have been stalled in the past because there wasn't a clear regulatory path forward, some of those are being revived. And she encouraged sponsors of therapies that were stalled to come back to CBER and find out if policies have changed in ways that would make it possible for them to proceed to go forward. One of the specific examples that she gave involved selecting patient populations for rare disease treatment trials. She said that in the past, CBER and FDA have required sponsors to demonstrate efficacy in adult populations before exposing children to an investigational therapy. She acknowledged the criticism that rare disease advocates have made, saying that for many of these interventions, the possibility of actually providing efficacy diminishes the more that people progress, that it's possible in many cases to halt or prevent progression, but it's a much, much more difficult task to reverse progression. She acknowledged that there's some merit to that, and she said that she supports allowing sponsors to test therapies first in younger populations before they progress. Amy Rick, who's director of the Rare Disease Innovation Hub, described the hub's goals and talked about meetings that they're going to be having in the future. I think just the fact that Amy Rick was there speaking in public and that she's still at FDA has given people some encouragement. She recently joined FDA, and she was in the so-called probationary period. A lot of FDA employees who were in probationary status were basically fired in the early days of the Trump administration. So the fact that Amy Rick is still there, I think, is encouraging to people. She talked about the scientific meeting that they're going to be having in September to talk about clinical trial designs, controls and clinical trial designs for very small populations, internal and external controls. And then she said that they're going to be having more meetings like that. And the hub is soliciting ideas from patient groups and from companies for what the subjects of their future workshops would be. Basically, they're looking for topics that cut across rare disease development and areas where you can find scientific and regulatory consensus that will move things forward.
Steve, I mean, it all sounds very positive, and I think, given how much concern there's been about FDA out there, it's nice to have sounds like a bit of a positive message coming from FDA about these rare disease. I mean, did you feel that this intent on trying to fast track and, reduce the barriers for approvals? I mean, is this across the board at FDA? I mean, does this include CDERs, or does this include everything like from small molecules through to advanced therapies?
The intention to do that for rare diseases is certainly there. There were CDER leaders there as well as CBER leaders. There wasn't any willingness to talk about it, but people kind of acknowledged privately, FDA staff are working to try to make real the commitment that Commissioner McCary has made to come up with a new pathway for therapies for ultra rare diseases. That would be CDER and CBER. But, there is the kind of what I've called the elephant in the room, which is the fact that FDA has lost a lot of staff. They've lost reviewers. They've lost policy officials. They've lost administrative staff. And so what people told me privately is that it's very challenging in this environment to craft and implement new policies when they're really struggling just to keep up with the PDUFA goals for what they're required to do. So there's a kind of a disconnect between the messages that we're getting from leadership and the things that I'm hearing privately from reviewers who are on the ground there trying to actually keep their head above water. So it's going to be really interesting, and I think it's challenging for FDA to kind of bridge that gap between their aspirations to really move forward aggressively and coming up with policies that are going to make it possible to unleash more therapies for people with rare diseases, and their funding and personnel challenges that make it more difficult to do that. A final thing I would add, and another challenge, of course, is the reduction in investment in NIH research. The rare disease space is really uniquely, I think, dependent on NIH-funded academic research for making progress. And a final thing is the importance of the priority review vouchers, pediatric rare disease priority review vouchers. That program sunset last year. I've written and talked about that extensively on the podcast. Right now, there isn't a clear legislative vehicle for reauthorizing pediatric priority review vouchers, but I think that there's a bipartisan support for the concept. I think it's really critically important for maintaining forward momentum in developing therapies for rare diseases.
Well, because Steve, in reading your story, one other thing that came up to me when you sort of talked about this in terms of bridging the gap And it was one particular experience that I know you've written a lot about, which was the experience of Stealth Therapeutics and trying to get their ultra rare disease through at FDA. And I was just wondering, I mean, the difficulties that they've run into, do you think that reflects the difficulty that prior leadership at FDA had? And would current FDA leadership say that, well, that's the old regime and that's an example of why it was so difficult? Or does that, the fact that Stealth still had trouble, quite recently, does that reflect on the new leadership and the fact that they haven't gotten FDA to a place where they can sort of, I guess, bring their words to truth in terms of, putting it down?
Yeah. Yeah. I don't think it really matters so much what anybody says about it. The reality is it's on FDA now, today. And the fact that that therapy received a complete response letter, the fact that those patients are in limbo, the fact that FDA has told Stealth Therapeutics that they may not be able to put an indication supporting use in infants on the label. All those things are on FDA today. And I think that it is a poster child for FDA's ability to turn the intentions and the rhetoric of the administration into action. If they fail to do it here, then I think that it's really fair to ask whether all of the things that they're saying are meaningful, because this is something that's terribly important for these patients. And it's been this horrific regulatory roller coaster that they've been on for years and years. And it's also an opportunity for Commissioner McCary, for CDER leadership, to show that they actually are, doing the things that they have said that they want to do.
Yeah, as you much more eloquently put it than I did in my question, that's kind of what I guess I was getting at. Is the Stealth, is that sort of the most near-term potential opportunity for us to see if they're going to put their money where their mouth is, essentially, in terms of this policy?
Yeah, and there are others, right? There are some cell and gene therapy approvals coming up later in the year for rare diseases, and there's going to be whatever kind of steps the agency takes to put into practice the steps that Commissioner McCary has talked about for an ultra rare pathway. Vinay Prasad said in his talk that there's going to be some kind of a statement or an article published in JAMA in the near future that's going to talk about the steps that FDA is planning to take to accelerate the review of therapies for rare disorders. There was also a lot of talk at the meeting, including from Vinay Prasad, about trying to facilitate N-of-1 therapies. There's a lot of excitement around that topic. So there are a lot of opportunities for FDA to, kind of make real or to make good on the promises that it's been making over the last few months. I think there's a lot of enthusiasm in the rare disease community for FDA, and everybody, obviously they hope that they find ways to implement the things that they're talking about that the community supports.
All right. Well, thanks for that, Steve. What can I tell you? Next week, we hope to have Simone back. She can give us some highlights from the Grand Rounds conference that we just held in Chicago. Here it was a smashing success, so much so that everyone who normally is on the podcast who went is taking the day off, no doubt, to rest up. I'll be away next week. I'm hoping to do my first ever BioCentury editorial call from BioCentury's Washington office. We'll see if Steve lets me in the door or if he just sort of gives me the wrong address. I know he likes
I got a golden key for you. You're in here.
Excellent. And Steven, you'll be in Steven's capable hands on the podcast. Just be careful that he doesn't wander into discussions of the Minnesota Vikings OTAs or how the Twins are faring. As he
only do that if Lauren's back on. I know she likes to talk that, but otherwise,
Lauren does like her baseball. I can't get her to talk football, but she does like her baseball. And of course, Simone will be back, so she'll have all sorts of thoughts about Coco's win in Paris, as well as the exciting men's final. So rest up, Simone. Your sports podcasting fans await your return. And of course, we're really all about the biotech. We'll be back this week with 2 more podcasts. We'll have the BioCentury Grand Rounds podcast. Josh Berlin and Simone were on stage talking Grand Rounds at the Four Seasons at our Grand Rounds conference, digging into the topics of the conference, which focused on the academia industry interface on translational bottlenecks and how to overcome them. We will also have the BioCentury show. I'll be in conversation with S.J. Lee, the CEO of U.S. Korean cross-border biotech Aurum Therapeutics, to find out what they are working on and how he led the company to one of Kostak's biggest IPOs in recent years. And we'd like to thank Kendall Square Orchestra for providing the music for our podcast. We will catch you next week. Thanks for tuning in.
BioCentury would like to thank Icon Biotech for supporting the BioCentury This Week podcast. To learn more about how Icon Biotech can help you meet your critical milestones, go to iconplc.com/biotech.